important thing that might be done to rectify absolute poverty and maybe to mitigate relative poverty would be the provision of energy as cheaply as possible. And the second most important would be the universal provision of efficient infrastructure. Is that a reasonable, are those propositions reasonable from the perspective of an economist?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely crucial. But I would say that the energy infrastructure, the energy is part of the infrastructure, the generating, distribution, and transmission capacity you need to get power, right, to people. That's a crucial, we kind of, the extension of that is we don't like to live in a society where some communities are systematically don't have these things, right? We kind of think everybody should have heat, everybody should have electric, everybody should have mobility, right, in your community. So I would say absolutely, and that's why having these things, there's this big notion of equity, right, which is kind of this amorphous term, and some of us are bothered by the lack of definition. But in infrastructure, it is used generally. I think it's this old notion of universal service, universal access, where it's equitable for all communities to have this. And of course, consider myself to be an old-time regulatory economist, and I'm always harping on how these issues have been studied for a century or longer in the, to provide these basic services as the technology evolves. And now, of course, with this Zoom call, we know how important broadband internet access is, and kids need to have it for school, and people need to have it for work. And so we don't want either urban pockets to be left without it, or rural.
Well, the other thing that I've thought a lot about is Pareto distribution problems. And so, the fact that money, for example, does tend to end up in the hands of fewer and fewer people. You have to fight very hard to not have that happen. But that doesn't seem to me to be the case with infrastructure because, well, it can't happen that way. You can't hoard the highways. You can't hoard the electrical grid. And even if you did, it wouldn't do you any good. And so if you are actually devoted to serving those who are oppressed and excluded at the bottom of the socioeconomic and power hierarchies, then I can't think of a way to facilitate equitable distribution of valuable resources, especially energy, because energy is work. I can't think of a better way of doing that than to concentrate on infrastructure development. And so then that brings us to the next problem that's going to be a big one for this infrastructure bill is like, as pressure ramps up in relationship to climate change and the environmental concerns that go along with that, there's going to be more and more pressure on infrastructure development, in terms of regulating and suppressing it for that matter. And so that's a real tension on the left, I think, because the left tends to be more concerned, let's say, with broad-scale environmental issues, but theoretically also they're concerned with the poor. And there's a big tension there. And so do you have some sense of how those mutual goals might be brought into alignment with one another instead of acting in an antagonistic manner?
So, Jordan, I think you've hit on one of the most important and underappreciated issues in infrastructure policy. And I kind of regret that I didn't spend more time in my book that you have on this. But I've been studying this for 15 years now. And I would say there's been a slow revolution going on in the technology of infrastructure delivery, right? And some of those things make, the front page of the New York Times, and that's driverless cars, right? And the Hyperloop and things like that. But there's a whole host of other technologies that have been developed in the universities, in the labs, in the startups that stand to transform the way infrastructure delivery, infrastructure is operated and delivered in the United States. Let me give you a couple examples. One is smart stoplights, okay? Smart stoplights. I had a kind of a little briefing of this by the folks at Carnegie Mellon recently. And it's a stoplight, right, with different colors, but it has a camera and a sensor attached to it so that the lights are not just on a rote timer. They actually change in response to the traffic that's actually at the intersection. So many drivers have had the experience of going to a rural road and there's a red light, and because they're good people, they stop and wait there and there's no traffic in the other direction. And they just know that if the light knew that I was sitting there, it would turn green. What turns out, the technology has existed for a decade to sense the cars actually at the intersection and change the lights optimally in response to the traffic at the intersection. Jordan, they have it now to the point where they can sense pedestrians and include pedestrians in the changing of the light. They have it to dog, and they can tell a dog, they can tell a person in a wheelchair, and they can just change the optimize the changing of the colors to maximize the flow through the intersection. Now stop and think for a minute how much gasoline you would save if you did that. How much fuel, how much frustration, how much time,
how much pollution.
If we just had smart stoplights. Now there's something in the bill that's a pilot program to help with that, right? But the problem, Jordan, is not the technology. The problem is the adoption, right? Is getting the people who own the stoplights, who might be a small town like where I am in Ithaca, where it could be, a county, it could be a city, but it's highly atomized in the United States. But getting them to overcome their risk aversion. And I understand that totally. They're risk averse to new technologies. They're afraid of it. They don't, what we call headline risk. You're the mayor and you're afraid you're going to wake up tomorrow and find that there's been a giant crash because these stoplights malfunctioned, right? But we've got to somehow overcome that risk aversion to get them to adopt these new technologies.
Okay, so one of the things you're saying is that part of the infrastructure messaging, and I don't mean messaging in the cynical way, because I would hope that the messaging is actually associated with the underlying policies, so it's a straight game. But if infrastructure development means replacing inefficient use of resources with efficient use of resources, that should be a net gain on the economic side.
Yes.
So for poor people, plus it should have environmental benefits. So we shouldn't be thinking about exactly. How about priorities? Like you give the highway systems in this book, for example, in the U.S., I think it's a D, and the bridges a C minus. I know
That's
this was written
American
a few
Society
years
of
ago.
Civil Engineers.
Right. So if you were going to rank order infrastructure priorities in the United States, I know that's a big task, but you've thought about this for a long time. Like, what's really broken? Where's the biggest bang for the buck?
So Jordan, let me. Wow, that is a great question. The American Society of Civil Engineers has done a great job of pointing to the deferred maintenance, right, in the United States. So the bottom line is, I think the U.S. has done a good job of designing and constructing and building out new networks to ensure that all communities are connected, right? The interstate highway system, the state routes, the local streets, in infrastructure, same thing across sectors. But we've done so we're good at building shiny new things, but we're very poor at taking care of what we have already. And I think there's political incentives, right? If you want to be reelected, you want the ribbon cutting ceremony with the big scissors, right? But it doesn't get you reelected if you say we put 5 millimeters of asphalt on that bridge over there, even though the civil engineers are telling you need to resurface that bridge. So there's a problem with the political incentives that have led to these trillions of dollars, of deferred maintenance. And I think in the bill, so of course,
that's part of the debt. That's part of the debt, that deferred maintenance. Even
that's also part of
that's
also part of messaging failure. As you're describing the stoplights, and that's like the Send City stuff, right? You can plug in like the stoplights also have so many other aspects as charging stations, and the way that information moves now and polarizes and is sold, we expect politicians to also have to figure out how to be TikTok stars, that they know exactly how to sell everything in some magical fashion. And the lack of a proper messaging apparatus around some of this stuff is really costly. And people tend to forget that that's just as essential as figuring out the problems. If you can't sell them and communicate to people in real concrete terms, the ways it will affect their lives and their communities, it doesn't get adopted.
Yeah, right. So that's also an infrastructure problem in some sense, right? And a non-trivial one at that.
Also, this is where ideologies, and by that I don't just mean far left and far right, I also mean classically conservative and classically liberal. This is where they come to die in a good way in the solution of a problem. Like, if we can have this conversation about specifically how this makes people's lives better, maybe that's a solution that's 70% conservative, 30% liberal when it comes to some application, maybe. And so what's so important about boiling them down to this and figuring out how to talk about it is a lot of the useless ideological overlay to specific problems that concretely help the working class and the poor and actually make headway for community environment. We're talking about the communities that people live in, that they fish in, that small businesses are run in. That's where all the rubber meets the road. And
well,
then
Greg, it might be a rule of thumb that if the discussion is occurring at a level where all that's happening is ideological argument, then the problem actually hasn't been specified clearly enough to move towards solution.